Right, so what I'll present today is a paper that I've been working on and that I will eventually then load up on my thesis. So this is still work in progress. And what I'm doing was the aim of this paper is to examine the effect of exposure and the content of media on voter participation in European elections. You will see later that I'm using quite similar design to what ELECDEM was presenting earlier, so he saved me a lot of work by showing all those how he constructed the variables. Thank you. And just as background, since I'm studying turnout in European elections, there is a lot of literature on turnout and what affects turnout, especially in European elections and second-order elections. And there's loads of literature on the influence of campaigns and the media on participation. And what's the problem here is that, especially in European elections, when there is low-intensity campaigns of the parties, then we have a very low coverage of the campaign in the media, and then people don't have sometimes enough information to be able or to be persuaded to go vote. And what's one of the partial aims of my paper is to look at the differences between established EU members and the post-communist member states, and also to look at the differences within the group of post-communist countries, where it's still, I think, where the paper lacks the most. Because I wanted to stress that the post-communist countries are very often looked at as just one group, but there is loads of differences within this group, so I think that's one important thing that needs to be tackled. So why am I interested in studying the difference between these two groups of countries? Is because there's a huge difference in turnout, not really in national elections, but especially in the European elections, between the established member states and the post-communist countries. We have some numbers here, both in 2004 and 2009 elections. The difference was around 20%, which is quite a lot. And of course, there are many factors that play a role in this, such as compulsory voting, which is only in some of the established members, and just the better tradition of voter participation in established members than in the post-communist countries. What's also interesting in connection to my paper is that in 2004, eight post-communist countries, it was their first European election. So theoretically, we would be expecting the first election boost. But as these countries don't really have a tradition of voter participation or just political participation at all, the turnout was lower than was expected and than in established countries. This is just a graph just to show the numbers. I mean, we have the average of all members in 2009 was around 54%, and you see that most of the post-communist countries are just below this. As I said, there have been many studies done on turnout, what affects turnout or voter participation. And there are variables that usually distinguish on the system level or the country context level and individual. Sometimes also the party level is brought in. But since I'm not at the moment interested in the vote choice or the propensity to vote, I'm not looking at the party level indicators. I will probably go through these variables later when I will look at my model. But what's interesting here is that in established EU members, all these systemic levels, systemic level variables like the compulsory voting, the day of voting, the linkages between parties and citizens, and also the time until the next national election, they explain like most of the variants. But this is not happening in the post-communist countries, so there must be something else that explains the participation. So I was trying to see if media can maybe explain these variances. I think this is something we're all familiar with, the second-order theory from the 1980 Raven Schmidt's work. And we know that the European elections, there's lots at stake, although because they're usually the same candidates campaigning on national issues. That's why it's called a second-order national election. So usually these elections have lower turnout than the national elections. The major or the big and governmental parties do worse because people choose to vote maybe for the smaller parties for who they wouldn't really vote in the national elections, and the small parties, they do better. And also the knowledge about the EU plays a big role in whether people go vote in the European elections, which then goes along with that the European election campaigns are usually they have lower intensity than national election campaigns. And then of course the media coverage of these campaigns is lower as well. So what has been found before about the news coverage of EU in general and of European elections, that the coverage is generally very low, and as we have heard earlier today, it usually just speaks out around important events such as European elections or some referenda. And so the question is whether it really matters how much the newspapers or television write, or how much there is a coverage about EU. Because we would expect, and some studies have shown, that if there is more coverage about the EU in the country's media, the people are more likely to go vote. But then, of course, there's a question about already the political interest of these people and many other variables that play a role in here. However, what is the problem with some of the studies that have been studying before the influence of news coverage on voter participation is that they have been usually using aggregate level of media coverage. But because we have this great European election studies data, and what Vivian showed before, we can match exactly like what the individuals were exposed to and whether that had any effect. A little bit about media effects. I've mentioned before that the European election campaigns are not so intensive, which is where then also the previous knowledge of the voters plays a role, because if, as it was, I think it was Zahler, Dave, and some other people stated that if a voter has a lower previous knowledge, then if there is a low, not intensive campaign, this person is not very likely to be exposed to the message. But if then the campaign is more intensive, this person is more likely to be persuaded as opposed to a person with higher knowledge. And of course, the video analysis theory versus cognitive mobilization, the question whether media are likely to boost voter participation or decrease it. And it has been suggested and argued in some papers that even negative coverage of EU or what has been in the United States, some negative advertising, can in fact increase voter participation because negative information can be sometimes more memorable, so people just remember it and they go vote, or because there simply is more, simply more negative information than positive. And when we study the media campaigns, when we are interested in the effect of the campaigns on voter participation, we need to look at how much there has been EU news, what was their tone, and some studies also look at the how much EU issues there is in the news. And just briefly on whether post-communist countries or Central Eastern European countries, as I mentioned, the first election, that there was the surprise that the turnout wasn't higher. But simply these countries, they have not all of them yet stabilized perfectly the party systems. The governments go through different crises. People haven't formed enough party identification because also there is many new parties that arise all the time. And they just don't have the long tradition of electoral experience. And sometimes there's also this feeling that these countries are, well, most of them are small, so they don't really matter in the EU. And plus, as a post-communist legacy, there's a very low trust into politics as well as in media. Which is where one could argue that if people don't trust the media, why do I expect the media to have an impact? But I think even if people don't believe in media, but they're exposed to them enough, it still will have an impact on their vote. So my question is whether, after controlling for the traditional variables that explain turnout, whether the exposure and the content of the media affect voter participation, and how does this differ between the two groups of countries and within the post-communist countries, whether there is different strength of effect. So I've been using the 2009 European election Piraeus studies. I'm using the 27 countries or 28 contexts, since we have Belgium split in two. And my main variables is what Peter explained earlier, that the exposure of individual to media, and multiply with the content, with the amount of EU news and tone. I'm using both positive, negative, and then these two measures together to see whether it's more positive news that have effect or negative. And then I'm using all these compulsive voting time until next national elections variables that all then turn out to see significant. And also two variables that I was interested in is the questions that were asked in the survey. Is the interest in a campaign and actual engagement in a campaign. Like when it was asked how much time, how much did people actually participate in discussions or go to out to the rallies. And both these variables, they showed significant in the analysis. And I'm using multi-level since I have 28 countries. Okay, this is my description of the media variables, which I use what Peter described earlier. And then I have two models, but in one I'm using the most used outlets by a person, which actually this is what Susan and George just suggested in their paper at the Piraeus conference. So it's not exactly, but I'm using the outlet they use the most, and separately for television and newspapers. And in the other model, I'm using the average of the whole content, which may be a little problematic, since then we don't really see what exactly each person was exposed to. But this is what somebody else suggested, so I tried it, and there's not huge differences then. This is just my country variables, just to see whether the country level amount of EU news or amount of positive, negative news had any effect. And we can see that all these variables are significant, as well as the post-communist dummy, and also the time until the next election. This is just, all this is still work in progress, so these tables are, not very polished, not very, but this is just to see that if I run it using the most used outlets, it is the amount in both the newspapers and television, that if people are exposed to a news outlet that has a higher amount of EU news, this person is more likely to go vote. And then also, if a person is more exposed, there is the one, the television with the biased news. This has actually negative effect. And while the second model shows similar results, here I have the averages for the amount of EU news in all media outlets, which shows to be significant, and the amount of all biased news in all the outlets, which is significant, but rather demobilized high. Yeah. And all the other variables, they have similar but little higher effects in the second model. This is where I get to my, what was actually my main goal, to see the country differences. I'm still working on this. I was using the combing procedure that was suggested in Choosing Europe. And it's simply that using my models, I ran the regression, then saved the residuals from these models, and then sorted it by country to see which variables in which country still are significant, which can explain more. And the first findings, what I've seen is that generally My model explains better the voter participation in the post-communist countries as a group than in the established countries, and that there are some differences shown in these countries. So I would need to look in them like individually to see what is the problem there exactly. So just to sum it up, I already have a lot of ideas what to do with this next. Yeah, mainly to look specifically into the separate countries, taken all these suggestions that have been made earlier, and also just to make use of the data better, and eventually to look at the vote choice as well, not only at the participation, but at the vote choice. All right, thank you.